Welcome, witches. We're in our second video breaking down Reddit user Nice Guy Phil's disturbing movie Iceberg, and oh boy, did it get intense fast, you guys. I will admit I was only able to finish watching 4 of the movies that we're talking about today. I have at least watched scenes from all of these movies, or I've turned the movies on and then turned them off about partway through, because at a certain point of this video, I just had to accept that my mental health was more important than this. Unfortunately, there are a lot of extremely detailed plot synopses about all of the movies that we're talking about today made available online for, well, I was honestly gonna make some sort of self-deprecating joke about how not being able to sit through these movies makes you a wimp, but honestly, I think it was just human decency that made me turn it off in some cases. But without further ado, let's just get straight into the films. Life and Death of a, adult film gang. This movie is often compared to a Serbian film, which we talked about in the last video, due to the fact that it's another Serbian movie reacting to the overthrow of Slobodan Milosevic. Milosevic was brought into power in 1990 as part of this transition away from a Titoist one-party system, but he was ultimately overthrown in 2000 for war crimes. And I will admit that I did not touch on this enough when I talked about a Serbian film, but I have a legitimate reason for that. A Serbian film barely touches on it. As I mentioned in part 1, the director of a Serbian film claimed that he was making the whole movie as a response to the political sphere in Serbia at the time, but that claim mostly just comes across as an attempt to, you know, excuse all of the gross stuff that happens in that movie. If you remember from last time, that does include cheese pizza with newborns, which, I'm sorry, I still don't see how that relates. Life and Death of an Adult Film Gang is a more active response to this political sphere, however. The movie opens up on an aspiring filmmaker just finishing up his magnum opus, a movie that he considers to be a cultural landmark and full of political commentary. But when he submits this film to a producer, he's advised to go into adult films instead because that's where the money is right now. So he just does it. He gets together a group of queer sex workers and dominatrixes who start a cabaret club that ultimately gets shut down by the police and the media. At which point, they all go on this drug-fueled hippie road trip in this countercultural rebellion. Yes, this sounds amazing, but everything goes quickly downhill when the small-minded townspeople start acting like small-minded townspeople. And by that I mean, have you ever seen Deliverance? Multiply that. Once our group of sex workers have been dragged to their lowest point, they're approached about doing a snuff film. So they just do it. It's very much a movie about losing both artistic and human integrity, especially as a result of government or capitalist intervention. But there's a lot more going on here too. For one thing, some people interpret this movie as a critique on the sexual repression and homophobia in Serbia, by having the townspeople literally punish the sex workers with this mass display of sexuality that's festered and turned evil and violent. The character's desperation for money also speaks a lot about the wealth distribution in Serbia. And it's interesting to see this movie turn to war imagery considering the role that war would have had on the minds of Serbian people at the time. So basically, what I'm saying is, if disturbing movies about sex workers responding to the political sphere of Serbia are your thing, watch Life and Death of an Adult Film Gang. A Serbian film is just shock value for the sake of shock value. And I am more convinced of that after seeing what it should have been all along. August Underground. August Underground is actually a trilogy of movies, and I will be discussing all 3 because there really isn't a point on focusing on the first one alone. So the first movie came out in 2001, and I will admit that when I first watched it, I had just sort of stumbled across it by accident. So the opening scene, being very realistic looking shaky cam footage of a girl being tortured, did feel extremely brutal. It honestly felt like I had discovered something that I shouldn't have. But then the rest of the movie was just 2 annoying edgelords just sort of going about their day and occasionally torturing people. Fred Vogel, who wrote, directed, starred in, and did the special effects for all 3 movies, is very good at special effects. Not so much at the other stuff. but it almost doesn't even matter in the first movie because for some reason the whole movie has this weird filter over it that makes it look like a 3D movie that's come to us from a universe that hasn't invented 3D yet. Because of the way that it's filmed though, it might be easy to mistake for a real snuff film. Up until they get to a point where our two edgelords manage to escape the cops in the most unrealistic way possible, and this is a theme in all three movies by the way. Like, in order to believe that these movies are real, you need to accept that they take place in a universe where everyone has the IQ of a golden retriever. I'm sorry, I just don't understand how anyone thinks these are real. But Fred Vogel was detained at a Canadian airport when security found the DVDs for August Underground 1 and 2 on him. And he was held in custody for 10 hours while they tried to figure out if he was transporting obscene material over the border. So, on behalf of my country, sorry, I guess. But moving on to movie 2. August Underground's Mordrum was released in 2003, and it's definitely a more intense movie than the first. A big reason for this being the introduction of the character Krusty, our main edgelord's girlfriend, who you can sort of think of as Harley Quinn if Harley Quinn enjoyed torturing people in just the absolute worst ways imaginable. Krusty is basically just an amalgamation of the most shocking things a character can do. Like, the very first scene in the movie is her and her boyfriend getting in an argument after he walks in on her and her brother. And then she self-harms with a piece of glass to distract from the argument, and they have sex. Mordrum is honestly just a massive spectacle, and it ends in just absolute insanity, so it does seem like Fred Vogel realized that he really couldn't do anything bigger than that for the third movie. So he went in this really weird direction with 2007's August Underground's Penance, just by making it actually a little bit good. Like, I don't know if my brain is just fried by all the torture at this point, because Penance is still more or less the same as the first two, but at least it introduces a plot. At the end of the last movie, Krusty's brother died by but the whole thing happens like super abruptly. Like, it sort of plays off as though it happened in the spur of the moment, as though it might have even been influenced by drugs or something like that. But my point is, either this event or the general hardship of their way of life has clearly had an effect on Krusty by this point. And although she still joins her boyfriend on little torture sessions, she's starting to draw lines. She lashes out at her boyfriend after he, cuts a fetus out of a pregnant woman, at which point her boyfriend and abuses her. She's definitely not a passive victim, and it should probably be mentioned that she's still beating innocent women all the way through this. But the movie does end with her dying by in a much more intentional scene than what we got at the end of the last one, turning her weirdly into the protagonist of the entire August Underground series. Like, she's the only character that progresses and changes throughout the plot. With her death, the series weirdly becomes this story of this one woman who committed the most atrocious acts, but ultimately ended up becoming one of her own victims. That being said, I really do not think that was Fred Vogel's intention. From what I've seen, Fred Vogel is just a special effects artist who takes the art really seriously. Which, you know, cool. It is not a movie that I at all enjoy watching, but I do sort of respect the filmmakers and their reasons for making it. Guinea Pig. So Guinea Pig is actually 6 movies made in Japan, all connected with this theme of using someone as some sort of grotesque experimentation, usually involving body horror. If you have heard of them before, you've probably heard of the second one, Flower of Flesh and Blood, because it gained a bit of a reputation in the 90s when actor Charlie Sheen watched it and thought that it was a real snuff film. Now I'm gonna be smiling as I explain this. So he called the FBI, requesting that they open up.
It's so fucking stupid. It's so fucking stupid.
So he called the FBI, requesting that they open up an investigation, which is the sort of great promotional story that most horror movies can only hope to get. But the whole thing is extremely ridiculous if you've actually seen the movie. For one thing, the movie starts with this samurai injecting his victim with this serum that makes her not at all react to having her limbs cut off, despite the fact that she's fully conscious, and it's just like, I'm not sure that exists, Charlie. And even if that did, then why would a samurai-themed serial killer be using it here? What do you think is happening? Then the samurai sets up her body parts in this cute little nature scene, and yeah, it's mostly just this whole torture session. It's actually very similar to the first movie, except I think the first movie was a little bit more disturbing. The torture in the first movie is just slightly less, hacking off limbs, and it's more realistic. And on top of that, the victim is actually reacting, so some of the movies in this franchise are more body horror comedies, like He Never Dies, which is about a man who, well, never dies, so he just starts hacking at himself for fun. Mermaid in a Manhole is probably my favorite in the series. It's about this painter who discovers this dying mermaid and begins profiting off of her suffering by painting with her blood. It's a really good exploration of the role of the muse and how taking other people as our sources of inspiration can ultimately dehumanize them. Android of Notre Dame is about a scientist who begins experimenting on people in an attempt to find a cure for his sister's illness. And being who I am as a person, all I can think is that this is what would happen if DC finally gave us that Mr. Freeze horror movie I've been waiting for.
Rest well, my love. The monster who took you from me will soon learn that revenge is a dish best served cold.
And Devil Woman Doctor is one of the most amazing movies in the world. It's about this doctor, played by Japanese drag performer Peter, who treats her patients by comedically murdering them or mutilating them. Like, this family comes to her complaining about how they just can't get along, and she responds by making their heads explode somehow. It's great. 10 out of 10, no complaints here. Necromantic. I think you can guess what this movie is about. A couple who are obsessed with collecting body parts get their hands on a real corpse, and they start incorporating it into sexy times. Which seems great until the girlfriend decides that she prefers the corpse and leaves her boyfriend for it. I have to admit, as much as this movie is absolutely disgusting, and I obviously do not condone what it's about, I can't believe I even have to say that, there is something about this movie that I find sort of, cute, for lack of a better word. Like, when I was 13, I used to look like this, and I read way too much Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, and I used to listen to Creature Feature. The song Corpse in My Bed seems to come to mind right now for some reason. And I'm pretty sure that this whole movie was written by that 13-year-old. You know, in a universe where that 13-year-old had enough of a dating life to be bitter over a recent breakup, of course. I really don't know who would have been brave enough to date me back then, but maybe that's why I didn't write Necromantic. There is a scene in the movie where a real rabbit gets skinned on screen, but some people sort of give it a pass because they were just filming a farmer who was going about his work. They didn't kill the rabbit specifically for the movie, but still, your opinions on showing it on screen are probably gonna be your own, and I won't say you're wrong either way. There is some speculation that the writer might have been inspired by the real-life story of Karen Greenlee, an actual necrophiliac who gave a very graphic interview in the 1987 book Apocalypse Culture, where she detailed how much she loved the smell of a rotten corpse, and how she enjoyed the experience of watching blood spew from her lovers' mouths during intercourse. You can definitely see the potential for inspiration here, but the writer himself claimed that he was just trying to make a movie that would shock the West German Film Board, which, good job, man. You had a goal and you crushed it. Viva La Morta. Viva La Morta takes place at the end of the Spanish Civil War, and it's about a 10-year-old boy who has to contend with the fact that his Falange-sympathizing mother had his father arrested and potentially executed for being a suspected communist. A lot of people do find the theme of children coming to terms with mortality disturbing, but on top of that, there are some Oedipal themes that come up between the boy and his mother as he's trying to deal with what she's done. And on top of that, real operation footage was inserted into the movie at one point, plus a scene involving a bowl that gets converted into a sleeping bag for someone who really doesn't want to go to sleep. Snuff 102. Oh, this is a less fun one. Well, I mean, all of these are, but this one. So an investigator who's looking into a serial killer who preys on sex workers stumbles across this shock site that he uses, mixing adult situations with torture, which should also be an adult situation, but anyway. Actually, that should be a no-one situation. But in trying to find answers, our investigator and two sex workers wind up getting kidnapped and, tortured. I'm gonna have to admit, one of the things that makes me really uncomfortable with this movie is that it has a real virgin whore complex. While our journalist is able to get away in the end, the sex workers face torture that's really extreme and, kinda fetishizing. Like, I get that one of the things that this movie really wanted to explore was the sexual motivation behind certain types of violence, but yeah, that's really disgusting to watch. And the last thing that I want a director to do while showing a woman being graphically tortured is invite me to take pleasure out of it. Especially when this movie is simultaneously delivering the message that this torture is only acceptable to show when it's being done to sex workers. Violence against sex workers is honestly one thing that really bothers me in movies. And I usually try to hold my tongue because it's such a common trope in horror movies that if I brought it up every single time, my videos would eventually get repetitive. But that's part of the reason why it bothers me. We act as though violence is only a tragedy when it's perpetrated against a virgin. As much as sexual violence can be faced by anyone, it happens to sex workers at such a disproportionate rate that we really need to start being more disturbed by it. And to make it even worse, a lot of sex workers won't even report violence to the police because their work is already criminalized, making them, unfortunately, easy prey for predators just like the serial killer in this movie. Like, cute shock gore movie, dude, but I draw the line at you fetishizing the suffering of real people. Where the Dead Go to Die. So fun fact, I have reviewed this movie. I do not remember what I said in that video because my brain actively tries to block out any memory of this movie when I'm not actively thinking about it. And I do not encourage you to watch that video because my videos sucked back then. But back then, I called it the worst horror movie. Yeah, some other movies on this iceberg have joined that list, but this is still one of them. Where the Dead Go to Die was animated by one man, Jimmy Screamer Claus, who actually taught himself how to animate by watching YouTube videos and playing around with graphics programs, which is actually really cool. I do believe that it's important to learn about your field, but I don't think that that learning always has to come from formal education. And I fully support Mr. Screamer Claus's artistic journey. That being said, I feel like he could have watched a couple more YouTube tutorials. Like, this is hideous. And I would not be that harsh about it if it wasn't for the content of this movie. The movie is an anthology with the connecting device of this dog or hellhound or something that gets involved in all of the stories. The dog plays its most active role in the first story, where it kills a little boy's parents and then convinces the little boy to have sex with the dog on top of his parents' rotten corpses.
What the fuck? They're so gross.
Thank you. Thank you.
Like, thank you for not making me watch that.
You're welcome.
You put me through a lot, but...
The second story deals with a serial killer looking back on his childhood sexual abuse. The last story is about a little boy with a facial deformity who ends up developing a crush on the only girl in his class who's nice to him. But then he discovers that her father exploits her for, movies, so he decides to save her by being the other person to get involved in these movies with her. There is no artistic value to this movie, I'm sorry. This is just animated cheese pizza with a side of torture. And the only reason why I pushed myself through this movie is for a review that I hope nobody ever watches again. Melancholy Angel. I don't know how to say that in a German way. Melancholy Angel. Well, that was just failing completely. So this one, I don't know. I feel like there are just some people out there who really enjoy watching Christians do some messed up stuff. Like, I get it. It's supposed to be a critique on the corruption of the church, but still, what the fuck? Basically, just imagine a movie lawn orgy that includes some animals and some murder and some baby beheading and a lot of bathroom stuff. Like, yeah, it's gross, but it also sort of operates under adult film logic where the answer to everything is just sex.
At least when we were babies, we could play. Now we're adults. What are we gonna do for fun? Our taxes?
So at least it feels a little bit separated from reality that way, but yeah, don't watch it. Juvenile Crime. So this honestly has to be one of the most disgusting movies to have ever been made. It's based on the true story of Junko Furuta, which you may already have heard of if you're into true crime, but maybe not. It's fairly well known, but not spoken about as often as some others because of the graphic details of the case. Junko Furuta was kidnapped by 4 teenage boys and held captive for 40 days, during which she faced some of the most unbearable torture you can imagine. She was over 500 times, included with sharp objects and a lit light bulb. The boys would drop dumbbells on her stomach and even lit her on fire and then left the burn wounds to fester afterwards. Her body eventually gave way to traumatic shock, and after all the torment, she was laid to rest in a concrete drum. And the worst part of the story is that the heaviest sentence given to the monsters who did this to her was only 8 years in prison. Juvenile Crime is just a movie that exploits this horrendous crime in the most disrespectful way possible. I have to admit, I do usually feel a little bit uncomfortable watching movies based on real life murders. It does add an eerie layer to the violence on screen when you know that all of this happened to a real person. But the best true crime movies try to keep this in mind and, not turn it into torture porn. Philosophy of a Knife. Philosophy of a Knife is a sort of pseudo-documentary around Unit 731, with a lot of gory reenactments thrown in. And for those of you who don't know what Unit 731 refers to, during World War II, the Imperial Japanese Army set up a base where they brought in criminals, political prisoners, homeless and mentally handicapped people, and just about anyone who is suspected of suspicious activity, and they performed experiments on them, though that's a very loose term. They would intentionally infect prisoners with diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea. They would perform vivisections without anesthesia. They would remove organs or cut off limbs and then put them back in places where they didn't belong just to see what would happen. They tested flamethrowers and grenades on them. They placed them in low pressure chambers until their eyes popped. I could go on, but I think that's enough. And on top of all of that, after the war too, the US just kind of excused the whole thing because they wanted to profit off of the information that they got off of all of this, which... But yeah, Philosophy of a Knife is just a movie that exploits all the gore that would obviously come from that. Slaughtered vomit dolls. So yeah, this is another uncomfortable one, and I'm gonna try to keep emotion out of this one as much as possible. I will admit that these movies upset me, but it's important to stick to what's relevant, especially considering the director of this movie and the next two is an extremely controversial figure right now. If you do want to know more than what I'm saying in this video, then I'll leave you to do your own research. Slaughtered vomit dolls is an entry into the vomit gore subgenre. You can imagine what that's referring to. And it's a movie about a teenage runaway with bulimia who starts working as a prostitute, at which point she starts experiencing hallucinations of the deaths of her fellow sex workers. This is not a snuff film, there are no actual deaths, but the content of the movie does become especially disturbing when you consider the context of who Amira LaVey was. According to director Lucifer Valentine, LaVey was dealing with some pretty intense substance abuse problems when they met, and she moved in with Valentine after her father kicked her out of the house. At which point, Valentine and LaVey entered into a 24/7 dom-sub relationship where LaVey had to do everything that Valentine said without question. And it was under these conditions that Slaughtered Vomit Dolls was filmed. There's absolutely nothing wrong with a BDSM-style relationship, by the way. If you want a 24/7 dom-sub relationship, then more power to you.
Or less power, depending on which side you take.
It's just that between the drugs and the potential homelessness, am I not right to have some concerns? For what it's worth, Amira LaVey said that she had a great time working on the movie, and the only thing that she really felt forced to do was smoke a joint filled with maggots. So in this particular situation, it does appear as though the relationship was consensual. But that being said, it just doesn't make me feel any better about watching a woman who's so clearly out of it being choked and forced to vomit. And on top of that, the fetishization of bulimia is just disgusting. And it's just can we bring back that picture from earlier? The picture of me when I was 13? When I was researching this movie, I found a video of a pair of girls who reminded me a lot of the kid in this picture right here. And one of them literally said, "This movie makes me sad because it reminds me that I can't eat for a week." That is not okay. Regurgitated Sacrifice. This is the sequel to Slaughtered Vomit Dolls, and it's more of the same stuff really, although I do have two sort of things to say about it. I'm foregoing adjectives for now, I really don't know how to describe this. So there's this directing team that I went back and forth on naming in this video because you can find out who I'm referring to very easily by Googling it, but I sort of discourage you from doing that out of respect to them, You'll understand why in a little bit. So anyway, to give you a little bit of context here, they work in the realm of exploitation, but from a more modern lens. So you get a lot of exploitation works from a woman's perspective, for instance. I do intend to talk about them on this channel at some point because they are extremely talented and their movies do deserve to be better known. It's just that this really is not the video to bring them up on, because although they did act in Regurgitated Sacrifice, they asked to have their names taken off the cast list. These are not people who shy away from controversy either. I have like a little bit of a thing to say on this and a little bit, sorta, kinda, not really, but we'll get back to that. First, I have something to say about the movie, and it's a story that director Lucifer Valentine alleges is true about it. Keep in mind, everything that I'm about to say is unverified. It's just a claim from the same man who claims that it's possible to be 6'7" and 109 pounds. So keep in mind, this is going to be upsetting, but unverified. I'll spare you from having to listen to Lucifer Valentine's horrendous penmanship, but in this interview with Punk Globe, he claims to have entered into a sexual relationship with his younger sister, who was also blind and dealing with undisclosed health issues. He goes on to claim that when he started dating Amira LeVay, his sister, who he names only as Cinderella, became insanely jealous, and in an attempt to get a reaction from him, she started to reenact the scene from the end of the first movie for him to record. He claims that his sister did eventually die by suicide in exactly the same way that she would often reenact for him. And he also claims that one of her filmed reenactments is in Regurgitated Sacrifice near the end of the movie. I can't even with this guy, even if it was all just edgelord rumors just to market the movie with. You just don't say that stuff. Slow Torture Puke Chamber. This is the third movie in the Vomit Gore franchise. I wish the news that there were 3 of these movies would be shocking enough, but no, there's 5 in total. But I'm pretty much done with this franchise now. I think I've said enough to convince you guys not to watch it. But before we do move on, I do sort of want to go back to something. And that's sort of what I mentioned earlier about that team of exploitation directors that worked with Lucifer Valentine but asked to have their name taken off the movie. I have an extremely complicated thought that's sort of based from that, but to put it simply, not all exploitation movies are made equally, and it really isn't fair to judge all shock and gore artists based off of a few bad apples. And I even feel really uncomfortable saying a few bad apples because the few bad apples are really bad. Like, they're really bad. It's like causing harm in the world kind of bad. Like really, end of day, it comes down to each individual case, and it really comes down to the artist's intention a lot of the times. When I was in university, I accidentally trapped myself in a class on postmodernism that I really did not want to take because the reading list included things like Naked Lunch and Blood and Guts in High School. And if you think that watching these movies for 40 to 90 minutes is difficult, they're even more difficult to handle in literature form.
Did I ever tell you about the man who taught his to talk? His whole abdomen would move up and down, you dig? Farting out the words. It was unlike anything I ever heard. Bubbly, thick, stagnant sound, a sound you could smell. This man worked for the carnival, you dig? And to start with, it was like a novelty ventriloquist act. After a while, the started talking on its own. He would go in without anything prepared and his would ad-lib and toss the gags back at him every time. Then it developed sort of teeth-like raspy and curving hooks and started eating. He thought this was cute at first and built an act around it, but the would eat its way through his pants and started talking on the street. Shouting out it wanted equal rights. It would get drunk too and have crying jags. Nobody loved it. And it wanted to be kissed, same as any other mouth.
I think something in me broke that year, and that's why I'm able to handle these movies. But anyway, that course really did teach me that good art can and should be able to talk about anything, as long as it says something, as long as it evokes an emotion. But I want to take it one step further and say, as long as it evokes a constructive emotion. Constructive can mean anything. Even sadness or anger can be constructive as long as it motivates us to do the right thing. When I was researching for this video, I stumbled across this comment on IMDb that I found really interesting from someone who claimed to be a friend of the director of Life and Death of an Adult Film Game. And please keep in mind that I did not verify this person's identity, so for all I know that could be a lie. But still, the comment that they left was very interesting, so I'm just gonna read out how they opened it. I am stressing that I am a friend of Mladen Đurđević, the director of this movie, so my review may be biased partially. Yes, this movie is a shocker. All of you horror and sex scene lovers can find amusement in it. But this is not its primary role. It is primarily a metaphor of a life of anyone different currently living in Serbia today, and it was so for the last 20 years, since the war in Croatia started, probably even before that. It becomes sort of a cliche to think of all of these hyperbolic postmodern artists utilizing shock to get people's attention, but at the same time, we sort of forget that the motivation behind these movies can sometimes be to try and draw attention to a cultural problem that maybe we do need to attend to. Or sometimes the intention behind movies like this may not even be as complicated as that. Sometimes it's just about evoking emotion, which horror as a genre is entirely about. And that's how we end up with movies like August Underground. If you look at Fred Vogel's Instagram account, he just kind of looks like a normal guy. He posts pictures with his kids, he really has a thing for albums, like really has a thing. But he's very serious about special effects makeup, and part of that seriousness for a lot of artists like him is shocking people, showing them something they've never seen before. August Underground may have been a cheap-ish option for him to show off what he could do, sort of like a portfolio in that sense. Like when you actually sit down and watch the movies on this tier, it can become very easy to become depressed and overly confronted with the evils of the world. These movies reveal a very dark corner of humanity that definitely isn't entirely fiction, even if the movies themselves are. But there definitely is a difference between an actual artist working in the realm of exploitation and something like Where the Dead Go to Die, Juvenile Crime, or Slaughtered Vomit Dolls that isn't really trying to explore or reveal anything. It's just profiting off of the situations of vulnerable people while not contributing anything constructive to the world. And I'm definitely not arguing that any of the movies on this tier are good movies. In fact, I think that's part of their problem. For instance, I think that Life and Death of an Adult Film Game may have obscured their political commentary a little bit too much behind what I am assured is just a mayor wearing a silicone male private part cast. And when you watch August Underground, there's absolutely nothing to indicate that it's the portfolio of a special effects artist. So it comes across as the portfolio of a serial killer. The franchise also really has a thing for humiliating women that I can't defend and that probably should be acknowledged. They're bad movies with decent intentions, but those intentions aren't obvious enough for them to avoid getting compared to some of the worst stuff out there. I'm sorry, I know that I spent a lot longer on tier 4 than I intended to. It's just, as a writer, as an artist, it personally offends me to see people use the medium that I love so much for harm. You know, I firmly believe that art should be able to broach any subject. Call me a romantic, but I believe that art is the most human thing that we have. And we can use that art to explore and question real human issues, including and especially the issues that we don't want to contend with in our day-to-day lives. Or we can use it to extend our abilities and our perception of reality beyond our wildest imaginations. Sometimes people do need to put their pain into art. That's how they heal. I understand and support that 1000%. But once it gets to the point that you're using art to dehumanize and devalue real people, or to spread a message of hate and suffering, then that isn't art anymore. Personally, I live my life by one rule. If it harms none, do what you will. And apparently I'm gonna be taking that rule to this iceberg as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. As an artist, there's also nothing that I appreciate more than being able to share my words with people, so I really do appreciate you guys for giving me that opportunity. Seriously, even if I do have my shy days, just know that I do read every single one of your comments, and your guys' support just always brings a smile to my face, so really, thank you guys. If you were to go down to the description box, you would find the Amazon link to my book, Poor Pretty Creature, available wherever you can find ebooks. And well, I'm still here. Although it is completely unnecessary to donate, I do understand that a lot of people are struggling financially right now. I did just want to mention that I have a Patreon, which will be linked below, as well as give thanks to the people who already support me there. Andre K, Scott Falks, Thrill House, and Wilson L. Ricks III. Donations can be as little as $1 a month, but as I said, absolutely no pressure whatsoever. Your support means the world to me, but so does the support of every single person who gives a like or a comment or even just a view. I can't wait to see you all next time.